Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The afternoon light filtered through Dr. Reeves's office blinds in pale, anemic strips, casting bars across Sarah's trembling hands. She'd been staring at them for the past 5 minutes, watching the way her fingers wouldn't quite stop shaking, the way her wedding ring, she still wore it 3 years after everything, caught the light in small, cold flashes. Dr. Reeves was saying something about progress, about how Sarah had been doing better lately, about how the nightmares had decreased from 5 times a week to 3, as if that constituted healing. As if anything could constitute healing after watching your 7-year-old daughter vanish into the woods of Olympic National Park and never come back. Sarah's phone vibrated against her thigh. She ignored it. Dr. Reeves paused mid-sentence, his gray eyebrows raising slightly in that practiced, therapeutic way that meant he was about to ask her about her relationship with technology and avoidance. But the phone vibrated again, and again, and then it started ringing, the shrill tone cutting through the careful quiet of the office like a scream. "I'm sorry," Sarah muttered, pulling it out. Unknown number. She almost declined it, but something, some old instinct she'd thought died with Emma, made her answer. "Hello?" Static, heavy breathing. Then Christopher's voice, raw and terrified in a way she'd never heard it, not even when they were kids and he'd broken his arm falling from the oak tree behind their parents' house. "Sarah, oh God, Sarah, if you get this." More static, the sound of wind branches snapping. "We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have." There was this place, this clearing, these bones arranged in a circle, and Danny. He's a fucking idiot. He kicked them apart. He laughed, said it was probably just deer hunters or some shit, but Sarah, something's been following us. I can hear it at night. It sounds like, Jesus Christ, it sounds like it's crying and laughing at the same time, and it's so cold, Sarah, I can see my breath, and it's July, it's fucking July, and... Christopher, where are you?" Sarah was standing now, Dr. Reeves forgotten, her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to break free. "Isle Royale. We're on Isle Royale. We took the ferry 3 days ago. We were just supposed to camp and hike, and Sarah, the others, they're acting strange. Danny won't stop talking about how hungry he is even though we have food. And last night I heard him outside the tent making these sounds, these eating sounds. And when I looked out, he was just standing there in the moonlight, staring at me, and his mouth was..." The line went dead. Sarah called back immediately, straight to voicemail. She called again, and again. Nothing. Her hands weren't just shaking anymore. They were spasming, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that Dr. Reeves was now trying to regulate with his calm, professional voice that she couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. Isle Royale. Christopher was on Isle Royale, and something was wrong, and she was standing in a therapist's office in Seattle while her baby brother was... She was moving before she'd consciously decided to move, grabbing her jacket, her keys, her phone. Dr. Reeves was saying something about not making rash decisions, about calling the authorities, about her fragile mental state. But Sarah was already out the door, already in her car, already pulling up the number for Isle Royale National Park Rangers on her phone as she drove, one-handed, too fast, toward her apartment. The ranger she spoke to was polite but unconcerned. Yes, they'd received a report about a group of campers who'd missed their scheduled ferry pickup that morning. No, they hadn't found them yet, but Isle Royale was 206 square miles of wilderness, and it wasn't uncommon for hikers to lose track of time or decide to extend their stay. They had a search party going out at first light. Was she family? Yes. Okay, they'd keep her updated. No, she couldn't come to the island right now. The last ferry had left for the day and wouldn't run again until tomorrow morning. No, they couldn't make an exception. Yes, they understood she was worried. Sarah hung up and immediately started searching for charter flights. She found one, a seaplane pilot named Jack Corsetti who worked out of Houghton and was willing, for $800, to fly her to Isle Royale that evening. She packed in a frenzy: sleeping bag, tent, first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, her old hiking boots that she hadn't worn since before Emma, Christopher's birthday present that she'd never mailed him, a GPS tracking device with satellite connectivity that she'd bought in a fit of paranoia, thinking maybe if she could just keep track of the people she loved, maybe they wouldn't disappear. She threw in her medication too, the little orange bottles that kept the worst of the panic attacks at bay, that let her sleep for 3 or 4 hours at a time without dreaming of Emma's small hand slipping from hers, of the forest swallowing her daughter whole. The flight took 2 hours. Jack was a talker, tried to fill the silence with stories about the island, about the moose population and the wolves that had crossed the ice bridge from Canada decades ago, about the old copper mines and the shipwrecks in the waters around the island. Sarah nodded at the appropriate times but didn't really hear him. She was watching the sun sink toward the horizon, watching the way the light turned red gold and then just red, like blood in water. She was thinking about Christopher's voice on the phone, about the fear in it, about how he'd said the others were acting strange, and about the sounds of eating in the darkness. She was thinking about Emma, about how they'd found her jacket 2 days after she disappeared, torn and covered in something that the rangers said was probably just mud, but that Sarah knew, on some deep cellular level, was not mud at all. About how they'd never found anything else. About how Sarah had spent 6 months camped at the edge of Olympic National Forest searching, until Jacob finally left her, until she'd finally accepted that Emma was gone, even though accepting it had felt like dying, even though part of her had died. The seaplane touched down on Lake Superior as the last light bled from the sky. The water was black and smooth as glass, reflecting nothing. Jack taxied toward the small dock at Wendigo, the western edge of the island, and Sarah was out before he'd fully stopped, her backpack already on, her flashlight already lit. "Hey, hold on," Jack called after her. "You need to check in with the ranger station, and you can't just go hiking in the dark, Jesus lady, it's not safe." But Sarah was already running. The ranger station at Wendigo was closed, a note on the door saying the staff had gone out on a search and rescue operation and would return by morning. Sarah didn't wait. She pulled out Christopher's GPS device. She'd synced it with her phone months ago when she'd bought it, and please God, let him have his phone on him. Let the battery not be dead. And pulled up the tracking app. For a long moment, nothing. Then a single ping, far to the east, somewhere in the interior of the island. The signal was weak, flickering, but it was there. Sarah started walking. The trail from Wendigo headed east along the Greenstone Ridge, the main hiking route that ran the length of the island. In daylight, it would have been beautiful, the forest thick with spruce and birch, the ground carpeted in ferns, the occasional clearing offering views of the lake. In darkness, it was something else entirely. Sarah's flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the pressing black, illuminating only a few feet of trail at a time, turning the trees into towering shadows that seemed to lean in, watching. The temperature had dropped precipitously once the sun set, and Sarah could see her breath misting in the beam of her light. In July, just like Christopher had said, she'd been walking for maybe an hour when she heard it for the first time. A sound like crying, high and thin and achingly sad, echoing through the trees from somewhere ahead. Sarah froze, her heart stuttering. It sounded almost like a child. It sounded almost like Emma. "Hello?" Her voice came out as a whisper. She tried again, louder. "Hello? Is someone there?" The crying stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space, so complete and absolute that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood moving through her veins. Then, from the same direction, a different sound. Laughter. Low and wet and wrong, like someone laughing with a mouthful of food. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the flashlight. She forced herself to keep walking, to follow the trail, to not think about the sounds, to focus on the GPS ping on her phone that was getting stronger. Christopher was ahead. Christopher needed her. That was all that mattered. The trail wound through dense forest, climbing gradually. Sarah's legs burned, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was out of shape, hadn't hiked like this since before Emma, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The crying came again, closer now, and with it that smell, thick and rotten and sweet, like meat left too long in the sun. Sarah gagged, pulled her jacket over her nose and mouth, kept moving. She found the first sign 2 hours in, a backpack, torn open, its contents scattered across the trail. Granola bars with the wrappers gnawed through, a sleeping bag shredded to tatters, and blood. Not a lot, but enough. Dark stains on the fabric, on the scattered clothes, on the pale bark of a nearby birch tree where something had been scraped or scratched or... Sarah's phone buzzed. The GPS signal was stronger now, pinging from somewhere just ahead, maybe a quarter mile. She picked up her pace, stepping over the destroyed backpack, trying not to think about whose it might have been, trying not to think about the blood. The trail opened into a clearing, and Sarah stopped so suddenly she almost fell. In the center of the clearing, barely visible in the shifting beam of her flashlight, was a circle of bones. Animal bones, she thought at first, had to be animal bones, arranged in a careful pattern, interspersed with stones and what looked like bundles of dried grass or sage. And in the very center, a skull, too large to be human. She thought maybe moose or bear. The bones were old, yellowed, some of them carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Spiraling patterns and lines that hurt to look at, that seemed to writhe in the flashlight beam like living things. This was the place Christopher had mentioned on the phone, the place they'd disturbed. Sarah's anthropology degree, earned a lifetime ago, before Emma, before everything, flickered to life in the back of her mind. This was a medicine circle, or something like it. Indigenous peoples had lived on Isle Royale for thousands of years before European contact. Ojibwe mostly. And the Ojibwe had stories about the Witiko, about the Wendigo, about the spirit of insatiable hunger that possessed men in the deep winter, that turned them into monsters, that made them crave human flesh. Sarah's flashlight flickered, died, came back on, the beam weaker now. She fumbled in her pocket for spare batteries with numb fingers, and that's when she heard the footsteps. Heavy, slow, coming from the trees at the edge of the clearing. "Christopher?" Her voice cracked. "Chris, is that you?" A figure stepped into the clearing. Tall, too tall. It moved wrong, jerky and disjointed like a puppet on tangled strings. Sarah's flashlight beam found it, and she heard herself make a sound, a small, broken whimper that she couldn't control. It looked like a man. It was shaped like a man. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too thin, the skin stretched tight over visible bones. Its face, oh God, its face, was gaunt, the cheeks hollow, the eyes sunken deep in their sockets and shining with a terrible, hungry light. Its mouth hung open, lips pulled back from teeth that were too white, too sharp, and it was covered in blood. Fresh blood, running down its chin, staining its torn clothing. Sarah. Its voice was Christopher's voice, but wrong, distorted, like someone speaking underwater. "Sarah, I'm so hungry." She ran. Blind panic drove her back down the trail, branches whipping at her face, roots catching at her feet. Behind her, she could hear it following, could hear the heavy footfalls, the wet, labored breathing. And that sound again, that crying, laughing, but louder now, coming from all around, echoing through the trees. Sarah's flashlight died again, plunging her into darkness. She kept running anyway, one hand stretched out in front of her, the other clutching her phone with its weakly glowing screen showing the GPS app. But Christopher's ping was behind her now, behind her and following. She crashed through underbrush, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. The trail had vanished. She was running blind through the forest, and some rational part of her mind knew this was suicide, knew she could run straight off a cliff or into a tree or... Her foot caught on something, and she went down hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Her phone flew from her hand, its light spinning away into the darkness. She scrabbled after it, her fingers closing around the plastic case just as the crying, laughing erupted directly above her. Sarah rolled onto her back, holding her phone up like a talisman. And the thing that had been Christopher was there, looming over her, its face stretched in an expression that might have been a smile. Its breath was carrion sweet, its eyes reflecting her phone's light like an animal's. "They tasted good," it said in Christopher's voice. "Danny first, then Rebecca, then Mike. They begged me to stop, but I was so hungry, Sarah. So hungry. And now—" It reached for her with hands that were too long, the fingers ending in split, ragged nails. "Now I'm hungry again." Sarah's hand found a rock. She swung it with all her strength, felt it connect with the thing's skull, heard the wet crack of impact. It reeled back, making that crying sound, and Sarah was running again, her phone's light bouncing crazily, showing her flashes of trees, of trail, of a cabin. Small, old, made of weathered logs. Sarah hit the door at full speed, felt it give, fell inside into darkness that smelled like must and old smoke. She slammed the door behind her, found a heavy wooden bar and dropped it across the brackets. Outside, the crying grew louder, joined by others. How many others? A chorus of hunger and grief. Sarah's phone was dying, the battery at 2%. In its fading light, she saw she was in a one-room structure, empty except for a stone fireplace and some rotting furniture, and on the walls, carved deep into the logs, symbols, the same spiraling patterns from the medicine circle, and words, scratched in rough letters: Wendigo, Witiko, Winter Devil, hunger that walks, do not speak its name, do not feed its hunger, do not break the circles. Her phone died. Darkness swallowed her whole. Sarah sat with her back against the door, listening to the things outside. There were 3 of them now, maybe 4. She could hear them circling the cabin, could hear their footsteps on the porch, could hear them testing the shutters over the windows, and they were talking, using the voices of the dead. Christopher's voice, and others she didn't know. Danny, Rebecca, Mike. "Sarah, please," Christopher's voice pleaded. "I'm hurt. I need help. Please open the door." "Don't listen," Sarah whispered to herself. "Don't listen. It's not him. It's not him." But it sounded so much like him. It sounded exactly like him. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time felt strange, elastic, meaningless in the absolute dark. Sarah's medication was in her backpack. Had she dropped her backpack? She couldn't remember. The panic attack started slowly, then crashed over her all at once. Hyperventilation, chest pain, the sensation of dying. She rode it out in the darkness, alone, while the things outside whispered and laughed and cried. Eventually she slept. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she just fell into some twilight state where nightmares and reality blurred together. She dreamed of Emma, of her daughter's small hand in hers, of how they'd been hiking, and Emma had seen something in the trees, had pulled away and run toward it before Sarah could stop her. She dreamed of Christopher as a child, grinning gap-toothed, showing her the frog he'd caught by the creek. She dreamed of the medicine circle, but in the dream the bones were human bones, and the skull in the center was her daughter's skull, and it was laughing. She woke to pale light filtering through gaps in the shutters. Morning. She'd survived the night. The sounds outside had stopped. Sarah stood on shaking legs and lifted the bar from the door. Pushed it open slowly, expecting, she didn't know what. But there was nothing. Just forest. Just the normal sounds of birds, of wind in the trees. The temperature had risen. It felt like July again. She found her backpack 20 feet from the cabin, its contents scattered but intact. Her phone was dead, useless. The GPS device, she'd dropped it somewhere in the night. But she didn't need it anymore. She knew where she needed to go. The medicine circle was deserted when she reached it in the full light of morning. The bones were still scattered where Danny, whoever Danny had been, had kicked them apart. Sarah knelt at the edge of the circle, her hands trembling, and began to gather them. She didn't know the proper rituals, didn't know the prayers or ceremonies that were supposed to accompany this. But she remembered what her anthropology professor had said years ago, that the Wendigo was created by taboo breaking, by violation of sacred law, by cannibalism in the winter dark, and that once created, it was nearly impossible to destroy, that it grew stronger with each person it consumed, that its hunger could never be satisfied, that the only way to stop it was to restore what had been desecrated. She worked for hours, arranging the bones back into their circle, replacing the stones, retying the bundles of sage. Her hands were bleeding by the time she finished, her knees aching, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and grief and terror. She didn't know if it would be enough. Didn't know if anything would be enough. When the sun began to set, she made her way back toward Wendigo. She walked without stopping, without looking back, even when she heard the crying start again in the forest behind her. Even when she heard Christopher's voice calling her name. The ranger station was lit when she reached it, and there were people and boats, and when Sarah opened her mouth to tell them about Christopher, about the medicine circle, about the Wendigo, what came out instead was a scream that didn't stop for a very long time. They found Christopher's body 3 days later, along with the bodies of his 3 friends. The official report said they'd likely died of exposure and possible cannibalism due to extreme hunger and psychosis. Sarah knew better. She'd seen what Christopher had become, what they'd all become, but she also knew no one would believe her. She returned to Seattle, returned to Dr. Reeves's office, took her medication, tried to sleep without dreaming. Sometimes it even worked, but on cold nights, even in summer, she would wake to the sound of crying in the darkness. And she would lie there, listening, wondering if the medicine circle had been enough, wondering if she'd really restored it correctly, wondering if the hunger that walked had been satisfied, or if it was still out there, still feeding, still growing, wondering if someday she would answer her door and find Christopher standing there, gaunt and hollow-eyed, whispering that he was hungry. She never went hiking again, never went into the woods, never took another phone call from an unknown number. And every year, on the anniversary of Christopher's death, she donated money to the Ojibwe tribes of the Great Lakes region, earmarked specifically for the preservation and protection of sacred sites. It was the least she could do. It was all she could do. It would never be enough. Because Sarah had learned something in that cabin on Isle Royale, something that the carved warnings on the walls had tried to tell her. Some hungers cannot be satisfied. Some violations cannot be undone. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. And the Wendigo, the Witiko, the winter devil, the hunger that walks, was patient. It had walked these forests for thousands of years before her. It would walk them for thousands of years after. And it was always, always hungry. Hope this story gave you genuine chills. If you appreciate authentic folklore horror, consider following for more. Which moment terrified you most? The medicine circle, the cabin, or Christopher's transformation? Share your thoughts. Christopher Hayes had analyzed 847 missing persons cases in his 6 years with the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch. He knew the statistics by heart. Most disappearances resolved within 48 hours, either through rescue or recovery. The numbers didn't lie. Data didn't deceive. Facts were the only religion he practiced, and the Olympic National Park's dense temperate rainforest was just another location on a map. Nothing more mystical than topography and weather patterns. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. on October 15, 2014. Lauren Mitchell, 28, experienced backcountry permit holder, hadn't returned from a solo 3-day trek through the Hoh River Trail. Her emergency contact, a sister in Portland, reported the overdue return with the kind of controlled panic Christopher had heard 1,000 times before. He took notes in his precise handwriting, already mentally cataloging the search parameters: last known location, equipment manifest, medical history, psychological profile. "She knows what she's doing out there," the sister said, voice thin over the phone line. "Lauren's been hiking since she was 12. She wouldn't just get lost." Christopher had heard that too. the belief that competence created invulnerability. He'd written that phrase in reports about recovered bodies more times than he cared to count. The morning fog clung to the park headquarters like wet cotton, visibility down to maybe 30 feet. Christopher loaded his truck with standard SAR equipment, GPS unit, topographic maps, first aid kit, two-way radio, emergency beacon. His approach was methodical. Each item checked off a mental list, refined through years of practice. He'd coordinate with the local ranger station, establish a search perimeter based on Lauren's filed itinerary, deploy ground teams if necessary. Routine, manageable, solvable. The drive into the park took 40 minutes through towering Sitka spruce and western hemlock, their massive trunks disappearing into the gray mist that seemed to breathe between them. Christopher had worked in 13 national parks across the western United States, and Olympic always struck him as particularly oppressive, not in any supernatural sense, but simply due to the sheer biomass, the way the forest consumed sound and light with equal efficiency. Rainfall here averaged 140 inches annually. Everything was perpetually wet, perpetually rotting, perpetually growing. Ranger Station 7, situated near the Hoh River Trail Junction, was a small wooden structure that smelled of coffee and mildew. Ranger Tom Keller, 62 years old and looking older, met Christopher with a handshake that felt oddly reluctant. "You're here about the Mitchell woman," Keller said. It wasn't a question. Her last known position was the Blue Glacier Camp, approximately mile marker 17.5. "I'll start there and work backward along the trail." Keller's weathered face tightened. "That's up near the old growth section, past the Seven Lakes Basin. That's what her permit indicates. Listen." Keller lowered his voice despite them being alone. "I've worked this park for 37 years. That area, people get confused up there, disoriented. Had 3 separate incidents in the last decade, hikers coming back wrong." Christopher felt the familiar irritation of having to navigate local superstition. Wrong how? Psychologically disturbed. One man couldn't speak for 2 weeks, just stared. Another woman kept insisting she'd been invited by something in the woods. Had to be hospitalized. Trauma responses to being lost aren't uncommon, Ranger Keller. Exposure, hypothermia, panic, they all affect cognitive function. Maybe. Keller turned toward a detailed map on the wall, his finger tracing a section marked with faded red ink. But the Quileute people won't go past those markers. Haven't for generations. They call it Tacoma's breathing ground. Say the spirits there don't distinguish between visitor and violator. Christopher studied the map professionally, noting the terrain elevation and potential hazard zones. "I appreciate the local context, but I need to focus on evidence-based search protocols. Just be careful up there, and if you hear singing, especially at dusk, don't follow it." The comment was so absurd, Christopher didn't bother responding. He gathered his pack, confirmed radio check-in protocols, and headed into the forest. The Hoh River Trail was well maintained for the first 8 miles, boardwalks protecting the fragile ecosystem from foot traffic. Christopher moved efficiently, checking his GPS unit every quarter mile, eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. Broken branches, disturbed moss, scuff marks on stone. The fog seemed to thicken as he progressed deeper, transforming the forest into a cathedral of gray-green shadows. Nurse logs the size of cars lay across the forest floor, completely consumed by ferns and saplings growing from their decomposing bodies. At mile marker 12, Christopher found the first irregularity. A cairn of stones sat just off the trail, clearly man-made but not marked on any official map. The stones were arranged in a spiral pattern, each one carefully selected and placed. Moss grew on them, indicating age. But something about the formation seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. Christopher photographed it from multiple angles, noting the GPS coordinates. Probably just trail markers from hikers, though the spiral pattern was unusual. He continued onward. The forest grew denser, the trees older. Some of the Sitka spruces here were over 500 years old, their trunks wider than Christopher's truck, the canopy closed overhead, reducing the already dim daylight to a perpetual twilight. His footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet of moss and decomposing needles. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant rush of the Ho River and the occasional drip of condensation from high branches. At mile marker 15.3, Christopher found Lauren's first campsite. The tent was still standing, properly staked, completely undamaged. Inside, he found her sleeping bag neatly rolled, cooking equipment cleaned and stowed, even her journal tucked into a side pocket. Christopher pulled on latex gloves and carefully opened the journal, flipping to the most recent entry. October 12th, Day 1. Made it to first camp by 3 p.m. Forest is incredible here, so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. Saw the most beautiful Roosevelt elk around dusk, just standing at the tree line watching me. Something peaceful about being this isolated. Finally feel like I can think clearly. Nothing alarming. He continued reading. October 13th. Day 2. Hiked further than planned, maybe mile 17. Found something strange, a clearing that's not on any map. The trees form a perfect circle around it, and there are these carved posts, maybe 10 feet tall with faces on them. Native American? They look old but somehow preserved. Took photos. The clearing has this weird quality, like the sound just stops there. Need to ask rangers about it when I get back. Christopher's analytical mind immediately categorized this. Undocumented archaeological site, potentially significant. He continued reading, noting how Lauren's handwriting became less controlled. Still, October 13th. Later. Something followed me back to camp. I didn't see it, but I could feel it moving parallel to the trail, maybe 30 yards out. Large, based on the sound. Elk, maybe? But it stopped when I stopped. Started when I started. Tried to get a look, but the fog is too thick. Probably just curious wildlife. But the way it moved, almost deliberate, almost intelligent. The next entry was barely legible. October 14th. Can't leave. Tried 3 times. Every path circles back to the clearing. Compass spinning. GPS dead. It's watching from the posts. Faces changing. Not carved. Wearing. Lauren, if you're reading this later, if you made it out and forgot, run. Don't come back to... The entry ended mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank except for a single symbol drawn in pencil, a circle with 4 lines extending from it, each ending in what looked like an animal head. Christopher felt his pulse elevate slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition of a serious situation. Heat stroke could cause hallucinations, poisonous plant ingestion, even a head injury from a fall. He carefully bagged the journal as evidence and searched the rest of the tent thoroughly. Everything was there except Lauren herself, her phone, and her camera. The radio crackled. ISB Hayes, this is Station 7, check-in, please. Station 7 Hayes, located subject's primary campsite at mile 15.3. Tent intact, personal effects present, no signs of struggle. Subject's journal indicates possible disorientation and hallucination. Continuing to reported secondary location. Copy that. Be advised, weather system moving in. Heavy fog expected through evening. Christopher signed off and studied his topographic map. If Lauren had truly reached mile 17, she'd be near the boundary of the designated wilderness area, where trails became minimal and the old growth forest was at its most dense. He checked his GPS unit. Full battery, strong satellite signal. Compass functioning normally. Whatever disorientation Lauren had experienced, he had the tools to avoid it. The trail deteriorated after mile 16, becoming little more than a game path through the undergrowth. Christopher marked his route carefully with biodegradable tape, maintaining his meticulous approach even as the terrain grew more challenging. The fog pressed in from all sides now, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. The trees here were ancient, their bark thick and deeply furrowed, some trunks showing massive burn scars from fires that had occurred before European contact. Then he found the clearing. It appeared suddenly through the fog exactly as Lauren had described, a perfect circle maybe 50 yards in diameter, ringed by towering Sitka spruce that seemed to lean inward, their branches interlocking overhead. And the posts. Christopher stopped walking, his breath catching despite his rationality. There were 7 of them, arranged in a circle within the clearing, each carved from red cedar that should have rotted decades ago, but instead looked freshly cut. The carvings were sophisticated, depicting faces that were simultaneously human and animal: wolf, bear, raven, salmon, otter, cougar, and something else, something with too many teeth and eyes that seemed to track Christopher as he entered the clearing. No. Optical illusion. Pareidolia. The human brain was wired to see faces in random patterns. Christopher approached the nearest post, pulling out his camera to document the find. This was significant. Possibly a sacred site that had somehow been missed in all historical surveys of the area. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each detail rendered with obvious skill. He photographed all 7 posts, noting that the ground around each one was bare earth, no moss, no vegetation, as though something in the soil prevented growth. In the center of the clearing was a flat stone, dark basalt, roughly circular and maybe 6 feet in diameter. Its surface was covered in carved symbols, weathered but still visible. Christopher recognized some elements: spirals, animal tracks, anthropomorphic figures, but the overall meaning eluded him. He'd need to consult with tribal historians, archaeologists, specialists in Pacific Northwest indigenous cultures. He was kneeling to photograph the stone when he heard it. Singing. Christopher's head snapped up. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere. A voice, multiple voices, humming a melody without words, rising and falling in patterns that didn't quite follow any musical scale Christopher recognized. The fog seemed to pulse with it, growing thicker with each oscillation. "Lauren Mitchell!" Christopher called out, his voice disappearing into the fog without echo. "This is Christopher Hayes with the National Park Service. If you can hear me, call out." The singing continued, unchanged. Not Lauren. The timbre was wrong. Too deep. Too resonant. Christopher felt foolish for even considering Keller's warning about singing in the woods, but he found himself checking his watch. 4:37 p.m. Not dusk yet, though the fog made it difficult to judge. He circled the clearing methodically, looking for any signs of Lauren's passage. Disturbed earth, torn fabric, blood, anything. The singing grew louder, and Christopher realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature that it was coming from the posts themselves. Impossible. Acoustic trick. Wind moving through the carved features creating sound, like how power lines could hum. But there was no wind. The air in the clearing was completely still. Christopher's training overrode his growing unease. Document, analyze, report. He took more photos, recorded video, marked GPS coordinates. Every action deliberate and professional, because that was how you maintained control in uncertain situations. You followed protocol. That's when he saw the footprints. They led from the center stone into the forest, but wrong. All wrong. They started as human. He could clearly see the tread pattern of hiking boots, Lauren's size based on the dimensions. But after 10 feet, they changed. Became longer, wider. The tread pattern distorted, then disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked more like animal tracks. Large animal tracks. Bear maybe, except bears didn't have 5 distinct claw marks arranged quite that way. Christopher photographed them, his hand steady despite the wrongness of what he was seeing. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe Lauren had injured her feet, removed her boots, walked barefoot. Maybe an animal had walked over her tracks, creating this composite impression. Maybe. The post with too many teeth groaned. Christopher spun toward it. The carved face was different. He was certain of it. The mouth had been closed in his earlier photos. He'd verify that later, but now it was open. Wide open. Wider than wood grain should allow. Wider than physics should permit. And inside that mouth was darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than the post's dimensions allowed. "Cognitive bias," Christopher said aloud, his voice tight. "Pattern recognition error. You're seeing what Lauren's journal suggested you'd see." But the singing grew louder, and now he could distinguish words. Not English. Not any language he recognized. but the intonation carried meaning nevertheless. Intruder, violator, witness, join. Christopher's hands went to his radio. Station 7, this is ISB Hayes. I've located an undocumented archaeological site at... He rattled off the GPS coordinates. Request immediate backup and tribal liaison. Also, he hesitated, professionalism warring with what his senses were reporting. There are unusual acoustic phenomena here. Possible. The radio emitted a shriek of static that made Christopher drop it. When the noise cleared, Keller's voice came through, but wrong, distorted, speaking words that couldn't be Keller's. They've seen you now, the Tamanoose hunger. Why did you come to their breathing ground? Christopher stared at the radio. Ranger Keller, repeat your last transmission. Static. Then Keller's normal voice. Hayes, you're breaking up. Say again your position. I'm at... Christopher checked his GPS unit. The screen was displaying coordinates, but they were changing. Rapidly. Jumping hundreds of yards every second, spiraling outward from his position in a pattern that made no geographical sense. He turned the unit off and on. Same malfunction. Pulled his backup compass from his pack. The needle was spinning lazily, making full rotations every few seconds. Lauren's words echoed in his memory. Compass spinning. GPS dead. No. Christopher's voice was firm. Equipment malfunction. Magnetic anomaly in the rock. Everything has a rational explanation. The faces on the posts were all watching him now. All of them. Their eyes, which had been carved wood, were open, aware, and behind each pair of eyes, Christopher could see something moving in the darkness. Something that wore the carved features like masks, like the skins that it had stolen from things that used to be wood. Christopher Hayes, who had built his life on logic and evidence and verifiable fact, felt the first crack in his certainty. Because unless he was experiencing a complete psychotic break, and he felt lucid, clear-headed, entirely himself, something impossible was happening in this clearing. The tracks. Follow Lauren's tracks, find her, get out. Christopher moved toward the footprint trail, forcing his legs to work despite every primitive instinct screaming at him to run. The singing rose to a crescendo, and the fog began to move. Not drift, move. Purposefully. It flowed toward him from all sides, carrying shapes within it, shadows that walked on 4 legs and 2 and something in between. Christopher ran. The forest was wrong now. Geometry broken, trees repeated in patterns that shouldn't exist. The river's sound came from multiple directions simultaneously. His carefully placed markers were gone, or maybe he was no longer on the same trail, or maybe there had never been only one trail here. Maybe the forest had always had these extra paths that existed in spaces human perception usually edited out. He burst through a wall of ferns and nearly fell into a ravine that definitely hadn't been on his topographic map. Scrambling back, Christopher saw them clearly for the first time. The Tamanoose. They were not spirits in any ethereal sense. They were solid, physical, more present than the trees themselves. Each one was a hybrid thing, a fusion of human and animal that defied biological classification. The largest stood 8 feet tall, a merger of man and elk, its antlers spreading 6 feet wide, its eyes human and aware and hungry in a face that was neither human nor servine, but something that had learned to approximate both. Beside it crouched a smaller figure, female in general shape, but with the sleek fur and whiskers of a river otter, her hands webbed and clawed, her smile showing too many needle teeth. There were others. A raven man whose arms were wings and whose eyes held intelligence that predated language. A bear thing that walked upright with a gait that suggested it had once been human and remembered how. A salmon woman, whose scales caught light that didn't exist in the fog, whose mouth opened to reveal not a throat but a river flowing backward, upstream, against time itself. They circled him slowly, and Christopher understood with perfect clarity that he was prey. "You came to Tacoma's breathing ground," one of them said. Its voice came from the elk thing, but the sound seemed to emanate from the clearing behind him, from the posts, from the forest itself. "You walked where breath becomes flesh, where the boundary is thin." Christopher's mind, even in extremis, tried to process this rationally. Hallucinogenic compounds in the air, fungal spores. This isn't real. Real? The otter woman tilted her head at an angle that broke vertebrae in Christopher's imagination. You think the world you see is all that exists? You think your maps define reality? The Tamanus are older than your species' name for us. We were here when the ice retreated. We will be here when it returns. Where is Lauren Mitchell? The elk thing gestured with one massive hand. She honored the old ways, even unknowing. She asked permission. She listened when the forest spoke. You? Its eyes narrowed. You measure and categorize and think understanding is possession. You walk where you will and call it wilderness, as though your ignorance of a place's name makes it empty. Christopher's back was against a massive spruce, his options narrowing. 20 feet away, partially concealed by fog, he could see another figure. Human-shaped. Lauren. She was standing perfectly still, watching him, and as the fog shifted, Christopher saw that she was changing. Fur sprouted along her arms. Her face elongated subtly. Her eyes reflected light like an animal's. She chose, the Raven Man said, his voice like wind through feathers. The transformation can be gift or curse. She opened herself to it, became what she needed to be. Strong, free, beyond the small life she knew. Lauren, Christopher shouted. Fight it, whatever this is. But Lauren smiled, and it was a wolf's smile. I'm not fighting anything, Christopher. I'm finally understanding. They've shown me what I really am beneath the skin, what we all are. She took a step forward, and her movement was fluid, predatory. The Tamanus don't steal. They reveal. They strip away the lie of civilization and show the wild truth underneath. The circle tightened. Christopher could feel heat radiating from their bodies, could smell musk and earth and something older, something that made his hindbrain scream warnings his rational mind had no vocabulary to process. You have a choice, the elk thing said. Join willingly, like her. Let the Tamanu show you your true form. Or, its massive hand extended, and Christopher saw that the fingers ended not in fingernails, but in points of antler bone, sharp and jagged. We take what we need. Your fear, your struggle, the meat of your resistance. Both paths end the same, but one is transcendence. The other is just meat. Christopher's hand found his knife. Laughable weapon against what faced him, but the weight of it gave him something to hold on to beyond madness. I don't accept your false binary. There's always another option. The rationalist even now. The otter woman laughed, and the sound was water gurgling over rocks, over bones. Very well. Run, Christopher Hayes. Run, and see how far logic carries you in a forest that predates your species' capacity for reason. Run and learn that some things cannot be analyzed away. They parted, leaving a gap in the circle, an invitation, a challenge, a cruelty. Christopher ran. The forest bent around him. Distances expanded and contracted. He ran for hours or minutes, time itself becoming unreliable. The singing followed, always just behind, always just ahead. He could hear them pacing him, laughing in languages that had no written form, calling to each other about the chase, about the catch, about the transformation that awaited. His lungs burned, his legs cramped. His rational mind gibbered that none of this was real, but his body knew better. His body understood it was running for its life, or its humanity, or perhaps they were the same thing. He burst into another clearing, or the same one, he couldn't tell anymore, and skidded to a halt. The posts surrounded him, all 7, but now he could see what wore them, what lived inside them. The Tamanus existed in layers of reality, and the carved posts were just the surface, the masks they showed to ordinary human perception. Underneath, they were vast and incomprehensible, beings of pure transformation that shifted between forms the way humans shifted weight from foot to foot. In the center of the clearing, on the dark basalt stone, lay Christopher's GPS unit, his compass, his radio, his camera, all the tools of his trade, arranged in a ritual pattern around a central object, Lauren's camera. He approached slowly, picked up her camera with shaking hands, turned it on. The battery was full. The SD card contained 347 photos. Christopher began scrolling through them, his analytical mind seizing on anything familiar, anything that made sense. Early photos showed normal hiking shots, trail markers, landscapes, wildlife. Then the clearing, the posts, the stone, standard archaeological documentation. Then the photos changed. Lauren had been taking pictures in the clearing at dusk. The shadows were long, the fog was thick, and in every photo, in the background, visible only if you knew to look, were the Tamanus, watching, waiting, patient as the forest itself. The last photo was a selfie. Lauren smiling into the camera, eyes bright. And behind her, reflected in her pupils if Christopher zoomed in, were not the trees of the forest, but faces, hundreds of them, thousands. Everyone who had ever come to this place and chosen transformation, or had transformation chosen for them. A genealogy of the changed, stretching back before history, had words. Christopher looked up from the camera. The elk thing stood before him. Massive, majestic, terrible. "Do you understand now?" it asked. "We are not evil. We are not demons. We are the price of trespass, yes, but also the promise. Humans forgot the old contracts, forgot that to walk in the wild places means to risk becoming wild. Your ancestors knew. They made offerings. They asked permission. They understood that some boundaries are not metaphors. What if I refuse?" Christopher's voice was steady. At least he had that. "Then you leave. We release you. But you will never be certain. Every forest will whisper. Every shadow will shift. You will spend your life wondering if this was real, or if your mind broke under the stress of a failed search and rescue. You will second-guess every memory, every certainty. You will be haunted by the possibility that magic exists and you fled from it. And if I accept, you join us. You become what you are meant to be. We see into you, Christopher Hayes, beneath your logic and your protocols. You are not what you pretend. Your soul has teeth. Your heart knows the hunt. You deny it, but the denial itself is proof. The Tamanus do not create. We reveal." Christopher looked at Lauren, who had moved to stand beside the elk thing. She seemed content, peaceful, more herself than any photograph could capture, as though her human life had been the costume and this hybrid form was truth. "There's no going back if I choose," Christopher said. "There is never going back from any choice, only forward into what you become." Christopher Hayes, who had built his career on rational analysis, who had solved 847 cases through logic and evidence and systematic investigation, made a decision that had nothing to do with reason. He ran, not deeper into the forest, toward where he remembered, hoped, prayed, the trail had been. The Tamanus let him go. Their laughter followed, not mocking but knowing, the sound of creatures who understood that his choice to flee was itself a transformation, a breaking of the certainty that had defined him. The forest released him slowly, grudgingly. Reality reasserted itself in stages. First, the GPS began working, showing coherent coordinates. Then the compass steadied. Then the fog thinned, revealing familiar trail markers, the boardwalks, the mapped paths. Christopher stumbled into Ranger Station 7 at 11:47 p.m., 10 hours after he'd departed. Keller took one look at his face and poured him coffee without asking questions. "Did you find her?" Christopher opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "No. The search area is too vast. I'll need to organize a full SAR team." It was the truth, not all of it, maybe not even most of it, but enough. Keller nodded slowly. "The forest keeps what it wants." Christopher filed his report exactly as procedure dictated: equipment malfunctions, challenging terrain, insufficient daylight, weather complications. He recommended expanding the search but noted the low probability of successful recovery. He attached his photographs, carefully culling any images of the clearing, the posts, the impossible tracks. Lauren Mitchell was declared missing, presumed deceased, after 3 weeks of intensive searching yielded no results. Her family held a memorial service. Christopher attended, spoke about her obvious competence as a backcountry hiker, said nothing about transformation or choice or Tamanus, but at night he heard the singing, and in his dreams he saw the posts watching him with eyes that promised he could return any time he was ready to discover what he really was beneath the rational mind he'd constructed, like armor against wonder and terror in equal measure. Christopher Hayes went on to close 312 more missing persons cases. His success rate was exceptional. His methodology was flawless. But on foggy mornings when he looked in the mirror, sometimes his eyes reflected light in a way they shouldn't. Sometimes his shadow moved a fraction of a second out of sync. Sometimes he caught himself listening for singing that came from no human throat. The Tamanus were patient. They had been patient for 10,000 years. They could wait a little longer. Hope this gave you real chills. If you appreciate genuine folk horror rooted in authentic mythology, consider following for more. Which moment scared you most? The posts watching, the transformation of Lauren, or Christopher's ongoing uncertainty about what he really fled from? Tentar novamente. Dylan Reeves had always believed that the world operated on principles that could be measured, cataloged, and understood. As a criminal analyst for the National Park Service, he'd spent 8 years applying logic to chaos, finding patterns in the seemingly random tragedies that befell visitors to America's wilderness. Missing persons cases were puzzles with solutions, not mysteries with supernatural explanations. The universe didn't allow for anything else, and he'd built his entire career on that certainty. The helicopter's rotors cut through the Arctic silence as it descended toward the coordinates provided by the Alaska State Troopers. Below, the Brooks Range stretched endlessly, a frozen maze of peaks and valleys that had remained essentially unchanged since the last ice age. Gates of the Arctic National Park was one of the most remote locations in North America. No roads, no cell towers, no trails, just 8 million acres of absolute wilderness where human presence was barely a footnote in geological time. Dylan checked his GPS unit for the third time in 10 minutes, a Garmin E-Trex that represented the bleeding edge of portable navigation technology in 2009. The battery indicator showed full charge, and the coordinates matched perfectly with the trooper's report. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. The Chen family's base camp was located in a valley 3 miles east of Arrogech Creek, accessible only by bush plane or an exhausting overland trek that few attempted outside of summer months. Visibility's dropping, the pilot shouted over the engine noise, gesturing toward the clouds gathering above the peaks. Weather report says we've got maybe 4 hours before the next front moves in. After that, you're stuck until it passes. Dylan nodded, mentally adjusting his investigation timeline. 4 hours to process the scene, document evidence, and determine what had happened to 8-year-old Sophia Chen. The initial report had come in 4 days ago. A frantic satellite phone call from hikers who'd stumbled across an abandoned campsite with signs of disturbance. The Chen family, visiting from Seattle, hadn't checked in with their scheduled pickup. When the bush pilot arrived at the extraction point, nobody was there. The helicopter settled onto a flat stretch of tundra, and Dylan stepped out into air so cold it felt like inhaling knives. September in the Arctic was already deep into autumn, with temperatures hovering just above 0 Fahrenheit. He pulled his parka tighter and grabbed his equipment bag, nodding to the pilot. 4 hours, the man repeated, tapping his watch. I'll wait here unless that storm accelerates. Radio if you need early extraction. The campsite was visible from the landing zone. 2 dome tents erected near a cluster of stunted willows, the only trees brave enough to grow this far north. Dylan approached methodically, his breath forming clouds in the crystalline air. His training dictated a systematic search pattern, careful documentation, preservation of evidence. He pulled out his digital camera, a Nikon D90 that had cost him 2 months' salary, and began photographing the scene from multiple angles. The first tent showed no signs of forced entry. The zipper was closed but not locked, and when Dylan carefully opened it, he found sleeping bags still laid out, personal items arranged on a small camping mat. A child's stuffed rabbit sat propped against a rolled sleeping bag. Sophie's, presumably. Everything suggested a normal evening routine interrupted mid-preparation. The second tent was where things became strange. Dylan stood at the entrance for a long moment before entering, his analytical mind cataloging details while something deeper, more primitive, whispered warnings he couldn't quite articulate. The tent fabric had been slashed, not torn by wind or animal claws, but cut with deliberate precision. The sleeping bags inside were shredded, their synthetic fillings scattered like snow across the tent floor. But it was the smell that made Dylan hesitate. A thick organic musk he couldn't identify, reminiscent of wet dog but somehow wrong, mixed with something metallic and sharp. He stepped inside, careful not to disturb potential evidence. On the tent floor, arranged in a precise circle, were bones. Not human. Dylan's training allowed him to recognize that immediately, but carved with symbols he didn't recognize. They looked old, weathered, the kind of artifacts that belonged in museum displays, not contemporary campsites. Each bone was roughly 6 inches long, probably from caribou or moose, and each bore identical markings, spirals, angular slashes, and what appeared to be crude representations of figures with elongated limbs and oversized heads. Dylan photographed everything, his camera's shutter clicking rhythmically as he documented each bone, each symbol, each inexplicable detail. His mind raced through possibilities. Vandalism. But who would hike into one of the most remote locations on Earth to vandalize a random campsite? Robbery? Nothing appeared stolen. Expensive camping gear, a satellite phone, even cash in one of the backpacks remained untouched. Animal attack? The slashed tent suggested violence, but the arranged bones implied intention, purpose, intelligence. Outside the tent, Dylan found tracks, boot prints from 3 adults and 1 child, the Chen family, led away from the camp in a northeastern direction, toward higher elevations. But interspersed with the boot prints were others, bare footprints, human-sized but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and the gait, judging by the spacing, suggested something that moved on 2 legs but not quite like a human being. Dylan knelt beside one of the prints, measuring it with a ruler and photographing it from multiple angles. The print was fresh, probably no more than 2 days old. The toes had pressed deep into the partially frozen soil, suggesting significant weight and force. He traced the outline with his gloved finger, his analytical mind struggling to categorize what he was seeing. A sound cut through the Arctic silence, distant but clear enough to make Dylan's head snap up. It was a howl, but layered, harmonized, as if multiple throats were producing it simultaneously. Wolves, he told himself. The Brooks Range had healthy wolf populations, perfectly normal, except wolves didn't usually howl in the middle of the day, and this sound carried an almost human quality, like words being shaped by vocal cords not designed for language. Dylan checked his radio. Base, this is Reeves. I'm at the Chen campsite. Scene is unusual. I'm finding evidence of disturbance and some artifacts that might indicate... He paused, uncertain how to phrase it without sounding ridiculous. Some kind of ritual activity, advising that this might be more complex than a simple missing persons case. Static crackled back. Copy that, Reeves. What's your assessment of the family's status? Unknown. I've got tracks leading northeast, but they're accompanied by unidentified prints. Going to follow the trail while I still have daylight. Negative on that, Reeves. Weather's deteriorating faster than predicted. Storm fronts accelerating. Pilot advises immediate extraction. Dylan looked at the trail, then at the darkening sky. His training said to follow procedure, evacuate, return with a full team and proper equipment. But his mind was already running calculations. A child had been missing for 4 days in sub-zero temperatures. Every hour decreased the probability of survival. If there was any chance Sophia Chen was still alive, he needed to move now. I'm going to follow the trail for 1 hour, Dylan said into the radio. Just to get a sense of direction. I'll be back before the storm hits. Reeves, that's not... He switched off the radio and shouldered his pack. The trail led upward, into terrain that grew progressively more hostile. Dylan followed the tracks across tundra that crunched beneath his boots, past frost-shattered boulders that looked like ancient teeth jutting from the earth. The landscape felt primordial, unchanged since the planet's youth, and he couldn't shake the sensation that he was trespassing somewhere he didn't belong. 20 minutes into his hike, Dylan found the first offering. It was arranged on a flat rock, animal bones, fresh enough that traces of meat still clung to them, positioned in a pattern that reminded Dylan of the carved bones in the tent. But these were surrounded by something else, ashes from a fire, and in the ashes, teeth. Human teeth. Dylan's hands trembled as he photographed the scene. His rational mind offered explanations. Indigenous peoples in the region had cultural practices involving bones and ritual sites. This could be a traditional ceremonial location, nothing more. But the teeth bothered him. They were too fresh, too deliberately arranged. And there were exactly 8 of them. 4 adult-sized, 4 from a child. The howling came again, closer this time. Dylan spun, scanning the landscape, but saw nothing except endless tundra and distant mountains. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off rocks and reverberating through valleys. It was definitely not wolves. There was language in that sound, or something trying to approximate language, syllables that rose and fell with disturbing intentionality. Dylan's satellite phone chirped, a text message from the pilot. "Storm accelerated, leaving in 15 mins with or without you." He looked at the trail continuing upward, then back toward camp. Every protocol said to evacuate. Every instinct said the same. But then he saw something that made his decision for him. A small piece of fabric snagged on a willow branch, pink with white stars. The description from Sophia Chen's missing person report had specifically mentioned her jacket, pink with white stars. Dylan keyed his radio. "This is Reeves. Found evidence that Sophia Chen came this way. I'm continuing the pursuit. Do not wait for me. I'll shelter in place if necessary and radio for extraction when the storm clears." "Reeves, that's suicide. You don't have..." He turned off the radio again and moved forward, following the tracks. The trail became harder to follow as the wind picked up, but Dylan had enough experience to track the general direction. The bare footprints were more frequent now, as if whatever made them had been pacing back and forth along the same route. He noted with growing unease that the human boot prints, the Chen family's tracks, showed signs of stumbling, erratic placement. They'd been running or being herded. A structure appeared ahead, barely visible against the darkening sky. Dylan approached cautiously, one hand on the bear spray attached to his belt. It was a ring of stones, deliberately placed, each one roughly waist-high and carved with the same spiraling symbols he'd seen on the bones. In the center of the ring was a larger flat stone, darkly stained. The smell from the Chen tent was stronger here, that wrong organic musk mixed with copper and something else, something that made Dylan's hindbrain scream danger. On the sacrificial stone, because that's what it was, Dylan's pattern recognition couldn't deny it, lay more bones. But these were different. They looked human, small, recent. Dylan stumbled backward, his camera forgotten. His rational mind tried to process what he was seeing, tried to fit it into frameworks he understood. Cult activity, some kind of twisted survival situation gone wrong, psychotic break, anything except what his eyes were telling him. That's when he heard the voice. "You should not have come here, outsider." Dylan whirled. A figure stood at the edge of the stone circle, and at first glance appeared to be a man. Native Alaskan, perhaps, dressed in traditional clothing made from caribou hide. But as Dylan's eyes adjusted, details emerged that made his carefully constructed rationality begin to crack. The man's proportions were wrong. Arms too long, legs jointed in ways that suggested additional articulation points. His face, weathered and dark, held eyes that reflected the dim light with a tapetum lucidum sheen, the eyeshine of nocturnal predators. And when he smiled, revealing teeth filed to points, Dylan saw that his gums were black, not pink. The child made offerings to entities she should not have disturbed, the figure said, his English perfect but oddly accented, as if learned from very old sources. Her family sought to stop the ritual. They interfered. This is problematic. Dylan's hand moved to his bear spray. Where is Sophia Chen? Where is the family? The figure tilted his head with a motion no human neck should allow. A full 180 degrees. The child? She is becoming. The family? They provided necessary anchors. The old ways require balance, outsider. Blood for passage, flesh for transformation. The Adlet do not give gifts without cost. Adlet. The word escaped Dylan's mouth before he could stop it. He'd read about them in his briefing materials. Inuit mythology. Creatures born from a forbidden union between a woman and a red dog. Half-human, half-canine beings that hunted humans. Legends, stories, not real, except the thing in front of him was real, and it was smiling with teeth designed to rend flesh. The shaman teachings were corrupted, the creature continued, moving closer with a predatory gait that raised every hair on Dylan's neck. Long ago, my ancestors learned to walk between worlds, to carry spirits inside flesh, to become other. The missionaries thought they stopped us. But the old ways persist in the frozen places, where human law holds no power. Dylan backed away, his mind fracturing as it tried to reconcile the impossible. This isn't real. You're not real. There's a rational explanation. Rationality, the creature interrupted, and its voice dropped to a growl. Is a cage you built for yourself. The universe is vast and hungry, outsider. It operates on principles older than your species, older than your science. The girl understood this. In her innocence, she saw the truth. Movement behind the creature, multiple figures emerging from the darkening landscape. More of them, a dozen at least, their proportions wrong, their eyes reflecting green gold in the fading light. They moved with disturbing coordination, circling Dylan with the practiced efficiency of pack hunters. Dylan's hand trembled on the bear spray canister. If you've hurt her. Hurt? The lead creature laughed, a sound like bones scraping together. We have given her the gift of transformation, of transcendence. She will become as we are, eternal, powerful, free from the weakness of purely human flesh. Her parents could not understand. They fought. They failed. Their bodies now serve a greater purpose. The truth hit Dylan like a physical blow. The bones on the altar, the teeth in the ashes. The Chen family was dead, and their daughter. Where is she? Dylan demanded, his voice cracking. What have you done to her? The creature gestured toward the mountains. In the birthing cave, the transformation requires 7 days. She is on the 5th day. By tomorrow night, she will emerge reborn, unless... It tilted its head again, studying Dylan with inhuman curiosity. You interrupt the process, but that would kill her, outsider. The merging is too far progressed. Remove the spirits before completion, and her human flesh will collapse. Dylan's analytical mind screamed. None of this was possible. Shapeshifters, spirit possession, transformation rituals. These belong to folklore, not reality. But the evidence surrounded him. The creatures, the altar, the tracks, the carved bones, the testimonies written in blood and flesh. You're lying, Dylan said, but his voice carried no conviction. Am I? The creature smiled. You know the old stories, analyst. You read them in your files, dismiss them as primitive superstition. But every legend begins with truth. We are the Adlet, the first and eldest. We walked these mountains before your ancestors left Africa. The shamans learned from us, traded with us, feared us. They knew the costs and benefits of our gifts. This child stumbled into knowledge she could not comprehend, performed rituals she found carved on ancient stones, spoke words in Inupiaq that summoned us from the threshold. We came. We answered. We claimed what was offered. A child can't consent to... Consent? The creature's laugh was cruel. The universe does not care about consent, outsider. It cares about balance, about exchange, about power and will. The child had will. She wanted to be strong, to be fearless, to be more than human. We granted her wish. Her parents' deaths were necessary, collateral. Dylan's training tried to reassert itself. He needed to get to higher ground, signal for help, Evacuate, but his legs wouldn't move. Frozen not by fear, but by the terrible realization that everything he believed about reality was wrong. The world was larger, stranger, more hostile than his equations and databases had ever suggested. I can take you to her, the creature offered. Before the transformation completes, you can see what she is becoming. You can make a choice. Let her emerge as something more than human, or kill her to preserve your sense of natural order. Either way, outsider, you will understand that rationality is not armor. It is blindness. The circle of Adlet contracted, their eyes glowing brighter as darkness fell completely. Dylan's hand moved to his radio, but he knew it was useless. He was beyond the range of any help, beyond the reach of human institutions and their rules. He was in their world now, subject to laws written in blood and bone, long before civilization. "Show me," Dylan heard himself say. "Show me Sophia." The creature's smile widened. "Come then, witness, but know that seeing truth has a cost. You cannot return to your comfortable delusions after tonight. The threshold, once crossed, cannot be recrossed." They led him higher into the mountains, moving with impossible speed across terrain that should have been impassable in darkness. Dylan followed, his rational mind fragmenting with each step, his worldview collapsing under the weight of impossible evidence. The wind carried voices, or things like voices, speaking in languages that predated English, predated Latin, perhaps predated language itself. The cave entrance was marked with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness, phosphorescent fungi or something stranger, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Adlet stopped at the threshold, their leader gesturing Dylan forward. "She is inside. The spirits are nearly merged with her flesh. By midnight tomorrow, the transformation will be complete. You have until then to decide, analyst. Let her become what she wills, or end her, and maintain your species' precious monopoly on this world." Dylan stepped into the cave, his flashlight beam cutting through absolute darkness. The walls were covered in carvings, ancient petroglyphs showing half-human figures, ritual scenes, transformations captured in stone, and in the center of the chamber, surrounded by carefully arranged bones and smoldering herbs, lay Sophia Chen. She was alive, technically, but changing. Her limbs had elongated, joints visible beneath skin that had taken on a mottled gray-brown pattern. Her face still retained human features, but the jawline was extending, the teeth visible through partially opened lips no longer entirely human. Her eyes were open but unseeing, rolled back to show only whites that reflected his flashlight with that same predatory shine. She breathed, but the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too deep, as if something inside her was testing new lungs. Dylan fell to his knees beside her. "Sophia, can you hear me?" Her eyes rolled forward, focusing on him with terrible clarity. When she spoke, her voice was layered, harmonized, multiple throats speaking in imperfect unison. "Dylan Reeves, analyst, believer in natural law. You came to save me." "Yes," Dylan whispered. "I came to take you home." "I am home," Sophia not Sophia replied. "For the first time, I am home. I am strong. I am eternal. I am free from human weakness. You cannot save me, Dylan Reeves. You can only choose. Let me become or destroy what I am becoming." Dylan's hands hovered over her, trembling. His training said to evacuate casualties, preserve life, maintain hope. But what was he preserving? A transformation he didn't understand, orchestrated by entities that existed outside his reality framework, that would result in what? A child who could never return to human society? A creature that would hunt and kill to maintain its immortality? "Your parents," Dylan said. "They died trying to stop this." "They died because they were weak," Sophia's voices replied without emotion. "They could not accept strength beyond human limits. They clung to the comfort of limitations. I have no such weakness. I choose power, analyst. I choose to be more." Dylan looked at the girl creature before him, his mind racing through options, all of them terrible. He could try to extract her, carry her back to the helicopter zone, hoped that medical science could reverse whatever was happening. But the lead adlet had said removal would kill her. He could end her suffering quickly, humanely, preserve what remained of her humanity in death, or he could leave, let the transformation complete and live knowing he'd allowed something fundamentally unnatural to enter the world. Behind him, the adlet watched from the cave entrance, their eyes glowing in the darkness like a constellation of cruel stars, waiting, patient, confident in their victory either way. "The storm will last 3 days," the lead creature said from the darkness. "You will shelter here, witness the completion. Then you will leave, changed. You will know truth, analyst. You will carry it back to your world of databases and reports and rational explanations. And every night, you will remember this moment, this choice, this threshold. You will know that your species does not stand alone, that the universe is vast and hungry and indifferent to your rules." Dylan looked at Sophia, at the cave, at the impossible reality surrounding him. His camera hung useless at his side, loaded with evidence that could never be shared, that would be dismissed as forgeries or delusions. His reports and protocols and procedures had no power here, in this place beyond the reach of human law. The girl creature smiled with too many teeth and closed her eyes, returning to the transformation. Dylan remained kneeling beside her, his rationality shattered, his certainty destroyed, watching as something ancient and hungry wore the skin of a child and called it evolution. Outside, the storm finally broke, burying the mountains in snow, sealing Dylan inside the cave with his impossible choice. The adlet howled their layered harmonies into the Arctic night, a sound that carried across glaciers and tundra, marking territory that had never truly belonged to humans. And Dylan Reeves, analyst and believer in natural law, understood at last that the world was far larger and more terrible than his equations had ever suggested. The threshold had been crossed. There was no going back. When the storm finally cleared 72 hours later, search and rescue teams found Dylan near the Chen campsite, suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. He was incoherent, speaking about creatures and transformations and choices that made no sense. His camera contained only corrupted files, his notes illegible from exposure. They never found Sophia Chen. They never found her parents' bodies. They found only tracks, boot prints from investigators and others, barefoot and wrong, leading away into territory where helicopters wouldn't follow and maps ended. Dylan recovered physically. He returned to his analytical work, writing reports and processing data, but every night he heard the howling, distant, harmonized, speaking in syllables that approximated human language. And he wondered if Sophia was out there, running wild and eternal through the frozen mountains, wearing power like a crown and calling it freedom. The rational world moved on. Cases were closed. Explanations were filed. Life continued in its orderly, comprehensible patterns. But Dylan Reeves knew better now. He knew the world contained cracks where ancient things still lived, where human law held no power, where choices echoed across generations. He knew that rationality was not armor but blindness, and that seeing truth came with a cost he would pay for the rest of his life. The adlet still hunted in the Brooks Range. The transformation still waited in forgotten caves, and somewhere in the gates of the Arctic, a girl who chose power over humanity ran beneath cold stars, neither human nor animal, but something older than both. Dylan never returned to Alaska, but sometimes, on frozen nights, he heard the howling, and he wondered if she remembered him, the analyst who witnessed her rebirth and chose to let transformation complete. The threshold, once crossed, cannot be recrossed. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Dylan's place? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The gravel crunched under Rob Chen's boots as he parked his truck at the trailhead, 3 hours late. Amanda's Subaru sat alone in the lot, forest green paint dulled by a week of rain. He checked his phone one last time. No signal, as expected this deep into Olympic National Park, and felt that familiar irritation at her insistence on meeting here, miles from the nearest ranger station. To discuss urgent findings, she refused to detail over email. Rob had made his position clear during their last collaboration. He dealt in data, not drama. Their relationship had ended 8 months ago for precisely this reason. Amanda's increasing obsession with local indigenous stories, her suggestion that their wildlife surveys were missing something fundamental, her late-night rambles about patterns the Quinault elders warned about. It was unscientific. Embarrassing, actually, for someone with her credentials. But Amanda Kozlov had been the best field researcher he'd ever worked with, back when she still trusted her instruments over campfire tales. When her email arrived, subject line urgent, Olympic Peninsula data anomaly, professional curiosity had overridden his reservations. Besides, the Park Service was paying them both to complete the gray wolf population survey, and Amanda had been incommunicado for 6 days. He shouldered his pack, locked the truck, and started up the trail. The Hoh Rainforest section of Olympic was technically temperate, but it felt primordial. Sitka spruce and western hemlock towering 300 feet overhead, their trunks wrapped in club moss that glowed electric green in the diffuse light. Nurse logs, thick as cars, lay decomposing, giving birth to new trees. Everything dripped. Everything rotted and grew simultaneously. The trail to Amanda's research camp wound 5 miles through terrain that seemed designed to disorient. Rob had hiked it twice before, but the forest had a way of seeming different each time. Paths obscured by new fallen branches, familiar landmarks subtly altered. He maintained a steady pace, his scientist's mind cataloging details. Fresh deer scat, a Douglas squirrel's midden, claw marks on a cedar trunk that seemed unusually high. After 90 minutes, he reached the fork where Amanda should have placed a marker. Nothing. He checked his GPS unit. The coordinates matched, but the orange flagging tape she always used was absent. Rob frowned, consulted his compass, and took the left branch based on memory. The forest grew denser. Understory vegetation pressed in. Sword ferns head high, salal bushes forming impenetrable walls. The trail narrowed to a suggestion. Rob's boots sank into soil so saturated it squelched with each step. The canopy thickened overhead until only scattered coins of gray light penetrated. He checked his watch. 3:47 p.m., but it felt like dusk. Then he smelled it. The chemical tang of camp fuel mixed with something else. Something organic and wrong. Rob pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and entered the clearing. Amanda's camp looked like a photograph of itself, slightly out of focus. Her tent stood intact, fly properly secured. Her cook station was organized as always, bare canister closed, no food left out. Her equipment cases were stacked and locked, but the silence was absolute. No hiss of a camp stove, no rustle of movement, not even birdsong. The forest had gone completely quiet. Amanda? His voice sounded flat, absorbed instantly by the moss-covered trees. Rob approached the tent slowly, that old field instinct making him scan for bears, cougars, anything that might explain the abandonment. The tent's zipper was closed from the outside. He called her name again, louder this time, and received only silence in return. He unzipped the tent. Amanda's sleeping bag lay spread open, her field journal beside it. Her headlamp hung from the tent's ceiling loop, still on, battery nearly dead, casting a dim amber glow. Rob picked up the journal. She'd been meticulous about entries, dating, and timing every observation. The last entry was dated 6 days ago, October 7, 2014, 11:43 p.m. The sounds have changed, not just wolf vocalizations. Something else is calling in the forest. The recording equipment picked up frequencies that shouldn't exist, subsonic and ultrasonic simultaneously. The spectrograms look like, I don't know what they look like. Patterns, intentional patterns. The Quinault elder was right. We shouldn't have placed the cameras at DXWL. I told Rob it was superstition, but I was wrong. So completely wrong. They're not wolves in those photographs. I don't know what they are. If anyone finds this, don't go to the cedar grove at... The entry ended mid-sentence, pencil trailing off the page. Rob's hands were steady as he set the journal down. This was Amanda's idea of a joke, clearly. An elaborate setup to prove some point about indigenous knowledge or forest mysteries or whatever fixation she'd developed. He'd seen her passionate about theories before, but this crossed into theatrical. He backed out of the tent and surveyed the camp with a critical eye. Her camera traps. She'd taken at least 4 units into the field. Where were the cameras? He checked the equipment cases. Empty slots where the trail cameras should be. Her laptop was missing too, though her charging cables remained. Rob followed the logic. Amanda had taken her most valuable equipment somewhere, probably to this cedar grove she'd mentioned. He pulled out his topographic map and GPS. There were several cedar concentrations marked in the area, but one was labeled with Amanda's handwriting from their previous survey. Old growth stand, 2.3 Mina-e. The rational part of his mind insisted this was foolish. Hiking into unknown terrain with 4 hours until dark, chasing a colleague who'd apparently had some kind of breakdown. The professional part countered. This was his survey area too, and if Amanda had compromised their research or equipment, he needed to know. Rob loaded supplies into his day pack, took a compass bearing and started northeast. The forest changed as he walked. The commercial hiking trails were maintained, cleared, mapped. This was wilderness in the truest sense. No trails, no markers, no human touch except the faint traces of Amanda's passage. He found her boot prints in the mud occasionally, always heading in the same direction with unusual directness, as if she'd known exactly where to go. The trees grew larger, not just taller, but older, their trunks achieving diameters that seemed impossible. Some of the cedars were clearly pre-Columbian, their heartwood likely rotted out, transformed into hollow chambers big enough to stand in. Moss hung in curtains 12 feet long. The light dimmed further, filtered through so many layers of vegetation that it took on a greenish, underwater quality. Rob checked his GPS. 1.8 miles from Amanda's camp. The device's screen flickered, pixelated briefly, then stabilized. Low battery probably, though he'd charged it fully that morning. He heard water, a creek by the sound of it. Following Amanda's tracks, he pushed through a dense stand of young hemlocks and emerged at the stream bank. And stopped. The cameras were arranged in a perfect circle. 4 trail cameras mounted on trees at identical heights, facing inward toward the creek. Not the random monitoring positions Amanda would normally use, but deliberate, geometric, purposeful. Rob approached the nearest camera, a Reconyx model he recognized from their equipment inventory. The camera's LED indicator blinked red, motion activated. He'd triggered it by approaching. But the angle was wrong. It was pointed at the water, at a specific section where the creek pooled around a fallen cedar. Rob looked at what the camera was aimed at and felt his first genuine unease. The creek was flowing uphill. No, that was impossible. He was seeing it wrong, misinterpreting the topography. Rob pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to find north. He shook it, tapped the case. The needle continued its aimless rotation. Magnetic anomaly, he said aloud, the scientist's reflex to name and categorize. Iron deposits in the bedrock, volcanic minerals. Perfectly natural. The creek continued flowing upward, at a gentle but unmistakable incline. Rob knelt at the water's edge, put his hand in the flow. Cold, normal. He scooped water, let it run through his fingers. It fell downward, as physics demanded. But when it rejoined the creek, it resumed flowing up the slope. His eyes insisted on what they saw. His understanding of gravity insisted otherwise. He stood abruptly, disoriented in a way he'd never experienced. The forest seemed to press closer, those 4 cameras watching their impossible subject. Where was Amanda? A sound reached him then. Not quite a voice, but not quite wind either. A low vocalization that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Rob's training identified it automatically. Too low for most mammals. Probably subsonic vibrations he was only partially perceiving. Earthquake precursors could sound like this. Acoustic phenomena in box canyons. Natural explanations existed. The sound repeated, and this time Rob recognized structure within it, not random natural noise. Patterns, rhythmic, almost linguistic. He remembered Amanda's journal entry. Patterns, intentional patterns. "Amanda!" he shouted. "This isn't funny. Where are you?" The forest swallowed his voice. In the silence that followed, Rob became aware of something else. He couldn't hear himself breathing. The sound of his own respiration, usually imperceptible, was completely absent. He held his breath deliberately, then exhaled hard. Nothing. He clapped his hands. Silence. Rob's pulse began to race. He could feel it, the surge of adrenaline, but he couldn't hear it. Sound itself had become unreliable. He needed to retrieve Amanda's cameras, gather evidence, get back to the truck, and report this to the Park Service. Whatever was happening here, electromagnetic anomalies, infrasound phenomena, some kind of natural gas seepage causing hallucinations, it wasn't safe. Amanda had clearly been affected. He needed to find her. Rob approached the first camera, unstrapped it from the tree. The LCD screen flickered to life when he pressed the review button. The camera held 2,147 images. He scrolled through them rapidly. Empty forest shots, the creek, more forest. Then, on image 1247, something changed. A figure stood in the creek. Tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, covered in something that looked like moss or hair or bark. The image's resolution insufficient to be certain. It stood perfectly still, facing the camera. The next image was identical. And the next. 20 consecutive images of this figure, motionless, at 10-minute intervals. Then it was gone. The following images showed empty forest again. Rob's scientific training insisted on skepticism. Lens flare, shadows creating pareidolia, a person in a costume. But that height, that stillness. He scrolled further. Image 2104. The figure was back, but closer now, details more visible. It had facial features that were almost human, but proportioned wrong. Eyes too far apart, mouth extending nearly to where ears should be. Its arms hung well past its knees. Rob felt cold spreading through his chest. He checked the camera's timestamp. These images were taken over 6 days, the last one this morning at 6:47 a.m. He moved to the second camera, hands shaking slightly. This one faced a different direction, toward the cedar grove Amanda had mentioned. He reviewed its images, more forest shots. Then suddenly Amanda herself appeared in frame 843. She was running. Not jogging, sprinting with obvious terror, looking back over her shoulder. Her face was contorted in a scream he couldn't hear. The next image showed her falling. The next image was empty forest. Rob's breath came faster now, though he still couldn't hear it. He checked the third camera. These images were darker, taken at night with the infrared illuminator. He scrolled through them rapidly, his scientist detachment crumbling. Frame after frame showed those figures, multiple now, 5 or 6 of them, standing in perfect circles around the cameras, standing motionless for hours. Their eyes reflected the infrared light, glowing white in the darkness. The fourth camera's images made Rob drop the device. They were photographs of him, taken over the past hour as he'd approached. Him pushing through the hemlocks, him emerging at the creek bank, him standing exactly where he stood now looking at the cameras. But the timestamps were wrong. These images were dated 3 days ago. Rob staggered backward, his carefully constructed rationality fragmenting. This was impossible. All of it. The creek, the sounds, the photographs. He needed to leave, needed to get back to the truck, needed to call for help. The Park Service would have actual experts, geologists, and acoustical engineers who could explain. The forest moved. Not wind moved, not animals disturbing vegetation moved. The trees themselves were repositioning. Rob watched, unable to process what his eyes reported, as the hemlocks he'd pushed through to reach this clearing were now behind him, cutting off his retreat. The cedar grove he'd been walking toward was now to his left. The topography had rearranged itself while he'd been reviewing the cameras. "No," he said, his voice still soundless. "This is hallucination. Carbon monoxide. Altitude sickness. He was grasping now, throwing out diagnoses that didn't fit. Olympic National Park's elevation was barely above sea level. The vocalization came again, that subsonic pattern, and this time Rob understood why Amanda had called it intentional. It was language. Not English, not any language he recognized, but undeniably communicative. And it was close. He ran. Rob crashed through undergrowth, compass useless, GPS dead, relying on pure instinct to find his way back to Amanda's camp. The forest seemed to shift around him, paths closing, new openings appearing. He ran toward light, any light, and found himself at another creek, different from the first one. This water cascaded over moss-covered rocks in the correct direction, downhill, normal. He splashed across it, not caring about wet boots. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Not the crunch of human feet on forest debris, but deeper sounds, heavier, accompanied by the crack of branches breaking under significant weight. Rob didn't look back. His scientific training, his skepticism, his rationalist worldview, all of it had become irrelevant. Whatever was behind him was real in the way that mattered. It could hurt him. He burst into a clearing and stopped. This wasn't Amanda's camp, but it was a camp, or had been. Ancient by the look of it. Stones arranged in circles, fire blackened. Cedar planks leaning against trees, carved with designs he didn't recognize. And centered in the clearing, a pole carved from a single massive cedar trunk. Figures stacked vertically in the style of coastal indigenous peoples, but weathered almost smooth by centuries of rain. Rob approached the pole, chest heaving. One figure was still clearly visible near the base. A giant with exaggerated limbs, mouth open in a perpetual howl. Carved words he couldn't read wrapped around its torso. Dex Bewal, said a voice behind him. Sacred ground. Rob spun. An elderly man stood at the clearing's edge wearing modern rain gear, but with a bearing that suggested profound discomfort with being here. His face was deeply lined, skin weathered dark. He carried no pack, no equipment, as if he'd materialized from the forest itself. "Who are you?" Rob's voice had returned, he realized. Sound existed here again. "Someone who knows what you've done," the old man said. His English was unaccented but careful, each word selected deliberately. "You and your partner. You placed your watching machines in the forbidden places. You photographed what should not be photographed. Amanda, do you know where she is? Is she hurt?" Professional concern overrode Rob's confusion. The old man's expression showed something like pity. "Your partner understood at the end. She learned the proper fear. But you still think in your science words. You still believe you can explain." "Help me or get out of my way," Rob said, anger cutting through his terror. "There's something dangerous in this forest and I need to find her." "Yes," the old man agreed. "There is something dangerous. The Tsiatko, forest spirits. My grandfather's grandfather told stories, warnings about this place. The mountains have watchers," he said. "The cedar groves have guardians. They do not like being seen." Rob felt hysteria bubbling up. "I don't have time for mythology. Real danger." "Your real and my real are not the same," the old man interrupted. "But both will kill you. The Tsiatko were here long before your science. They will be here long after. You violated DXW, AL with your machines. You looked too closely at things that hide for good reasons. They showed themselves to your partner. Now they'll show themselves to you." The forest vocalization sounded again, much closer now. The old man's face tightened. "I cannot help you," he said. "I should not even be here. This place has been forbidden to my people for 6 generations. But your partner asked the right questions before she was taken. She sent messages to the tribal center. They sent me to see if you could be warned." He was already backing toward the trees. "There is no warning that will save you now." "Wait." Rob started forward, but the old man raised a hand. "Do not follow me. The Tsiatko are already watching you. If you run toward the sunset with no deviations, you might reach your vehicle before dark. Might." He paused at the clearing's edge. Your partner's body will be found when the spirits permit it. Usually they return the dead to warn others. Sometimes they keep them. I hope for her sake they were merciful. He vanished into the undergrowth with remarkable speed for someone his age. Rob stood alone in the ancient camp, his rational mind cataloging and rejecting. Local man playing on superstitions, elaborate prank, stress-induced hallucination. But his animal mind, the inherited wisdom of prey species, was screaming at him to run. The sun was visible through gaps in the canopy, hanging low to the west. Rob oriented himself and started moving, fast, but not running, conserving energy. Sunset was maybe 90 minutes away. The truck was, he checked his GPS, dead again, somewhere to the southwest, maybe 4 miles through pathless forest. He made it half a mile before he smelled it. Rot. Not the normal decomposition of the forest floor, but concentrated decay, the reek of something large and dead. Rob's nose led him toward the source before his brain could overrule the impulse. Amanda's laptop sat propped against a nurse log, screen open, miraculously undamaged. Surrounding it were bones, not scattered, not gnawed, arranged. Ribs laid out in perfect spirals, vertebrae stacked in cairns. A skull, elk, Rob identified automatically, positioned to face the laptop. The laptop's battery was somehow still alive, screen glowing. A single file was open. A video player, paused on the first frame. Rob knew he should run, knew the sun was sinking, knew every survival instinct screamed against staying. But that was Amanda's laptop. Evidence. Answers. He pressed play. The video was from Amanda's helmet camera. She'd been wearing it during field work. The footage started normally, her hiking through the forest, narrating observations. Following the wolf trail toward the Cedar Grove coordinates. No visual on pack members yet, but clear tracks indicate multiple animals. Scat analysis suggests... She stopped talking. The camera showed what she was seeing. The Cedar Grove. Magnificent trees, some with trunks 15 feet in diameter, surrounding a central clearing. And in that clearing stood the figures. 7 of them. 8 feet tall minimum, covered in hair or moss that moved independent of wind. They stood in perfect stillness, arranged in a circle facing inward. Amanda's breathing became audible on the video, rapid and shallow. "Oh God," she whispered. The elder was right. They're real. They're... One of the figures turned its head. Slowly, too slowly. A rotation that continued past human range. It looked directly at the camera, directly at Amanda. Amanda ran. The helmet camera showed jerking images of forest flying past, her breath ragged with panic. Behind her, impossible to gauge distance, came sounds of pursuit. Not running precisely, but displacement. Branches breaking, soil compacting under immense weight. "I'm sorry," Amanda gasped as she ran. "I'm sorry, I didn't know, please." The video cut to black. When it resumed, the camera was stationary, placed on the ground at an angle. Amanda was visible in frame, on her knees, looking up at something beyond the camera's view. Her face showed not just terror, but understanding. Awful, complete understanding. She spoke in a language Rob didn't know. Lushootseed, he guessed, the elder's language. Pleading. Apologizing. Asking for mercy in words her scientific training never taught her, but her ancestors' memories provided. A hand entered the frame. Not human. Not quite animal. Something between, covered in moss that grew directly from its skin. The fingers were too long, jointed in too many places. It reached toward Amanda's face. The video ended. Rob stared at the blank screen, his carefully constructed worldview completely shattered. This wasn't explicable, wasn't rational, wasn't anything his education had prepared him to accept. But it was real. Amanda was gone. Those things, the Tsiatko, were real. And he'd called it superstition. He'd mocked her concerns. He'd placed those cameras in sacred spaces because data trumped tradition. Because indigenous knowledge was quaint but irrelevant in the face of proper scientific methodology. The forest around him had gone silent again. Rob closed the laptop, tucked it under his arm, and ran. Southwest toward the truck, toward civilization. toward any place where reality functioned according to familiar rules. His legs pumped, lungs burning, pack bouncing against his back. The sun touched the horizon, light draining from the canopy. He didn't see the first Tsiatko until he nearly collided with it. It stepped from behind a cedar trunk directly into his path. Rob screamed, sound had returned, and veered left, crashing through salal bushes. His jacket caught on branches, tore free. The laptop fell from his grip, forgotten. More of them ahead. Standing between the trees, motionless but present, watching. 7 figures, maybe 8, arranged in a loose perimeter, herding him. Rob changed direction again, pure panic driving him now. His scientific mind had completely shut down, replaced by something primal and desperate. He ran uphill, downhill, through creeks and over logs, his sense of direction lost. The Tsiatko were always there, always at the edge of vision, guiding him deeper into the forest like wolves driving elk. Darkness fell completely. Rob pulled out his flashlight with shaking hands, flicked it on. The beam illuminated moss and bark and nothing else, but he could hear them moving. That heavy, impossible-to-ignore sound of massive bodies navigating the forest with inhuman grace. His foot caught on a root. Rob pitched forward, instinct making him tuck his shoulder, rolling with the fall. He came to rest against something soft and yielding. Amanda's body. The flashlight beam showed her face, peaceful now, eyes closed. She looked like she was sleeping. Her clothing was torn, skin marked with deep scratches, but her expression was calm, almost serene. Around her neck hung something new, a woven cedar bark necklace strung with carved bone beads. Traditional, old. They'd prepared her for burial, respected her in their way after she'd learned to respect them. Rob heard himself making sounds, sobs maybe, or hysterical laughter. His hands trembled as he checked for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. Amanda was cold, had been dead for days. The Tsiatko had kept her, returned her here in this place where Rob would find her. This place, he realized, was the ancient camp. The carved pole rose above him in the darkness, its eyeless figures seeming to watch. He'd been herded in a circle, brought back to where the old man had warned him. The Tsiatko stood at the clearing's edge. All of them now, visible in his flashlight beam. 7 figures, motionless, surrounding him completely. Their faces were clearer than in the photographs. Almost human, almost familiar, but fundamentally other. Ancient, patient, eternal. The largest one, the one from the videos, stepped forward. It looked down at Rob from its impossible height. When it spoke, the sound bypassed Rob's ears entirely, resonating directly in his chest, his bones, his skull. "You see us now," it said, the words forming in Rob's mind without language. "You understand." Rob did understand. The Tsiatko weren't animals to be studied or myths to be dismissed. They were guardians, older than the oldest trees, protecting places that humans had once known to avoid. They'd shown themselves to Amanda because she'd violated their sanctuaries, and they'd been merciful. They'd taught her the proper fear, accepted her apologies in her ancestors' tongue, sent her death quickly. But Rob had come after her, had continued the violation, had refused every warning, had clung to his rationalist pride even as reality crumbled around him. "I'm sorry," Rob whispered. "I didn't believe. I should have believed." The Tsiatko tilted its massive head, considering. Its too wide mouth moved, moss falling from its lips. "Your partner believed too late. She understood the cost of watching forbidden things. Do you understand?" "Yes," Rob said, and meant it. "I understand." "Good," the Tsiatko said. "Then we let you carry the understanding." They didn't kill him. That mercy, or punishment, wasn't granted. Instead, they stepped back, melting into the forest like shadows dispersing at dawn. Rob was left alone with Amanda's body and his flashlight and the terrible knowledge that he'd been completely, arrogantly, catastrophically wrong about the nature of reality. He found his way out eventually. It took 3 days of wandering, drinking from creeks, eating nothing, sleeping in fitful bursts while the forest sounds surrounded him. The Tsiatko watched but didn't approach. They'd made their point. When Rob finally stumbled onto a maintained trail, then to a ranger station, then to hospitals and police interviews, he told the truth. The whole truth. The investigators nodded and wrote stress-induced psychosis in their reports. Amanda's death was ruled accidental, exposure and hypothermia, complicated by a fall. The forest had killed her, they said. Just bad luck and poor decisions. Rob didn't argue. He provided Amanda's GPS coordinates, led them to her body, attended her funeral. He submitted his resignation to the university, burned his field notes, and never set foot in a forest again. But late at night, in his urban apartment with its controlled climate and rational architecture, Rob sometimes hears that subsonic vocalization. Those intentional patterns. The Tsiatko reminding him, some places aren't meant to be understood. Some mysteries exist to remain mysteries. Some watchers should never be watched. He'd wanted answers. He'd gotten them. And he'd learned that sometimes ignorance, that superstition, that reverent fear, is the only thing keeping you alive. The Olympic National Park Wolf Survey was never completed. Hope this story gave you genuine chills. If you appreciate authentic folkloric horror, consider following for more tales that blur the line between the rational and the impossible. What scared you most? The upward flowing creek, the photographs showing the future, or the Tsiatko themselves? Share your thoughts.